Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
More than 25 years ago, the late Professor Paul Borghi developed an interview series that he called Reflections in Time. It was intended to preserve some of the history of the University of Nebraska at Omaha by recording the experiences of faculty and others who contributed to its development. With the aid of the UNO Alumni Association, I began this new series to continue Paul's work. My name is Jack Newton. I'm retired now, but I'm still active as a professor emeritus. I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960 and served for 20 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I worked closely with Professor Borghi in the development of his original interview series, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue this work. And it's a pleasant afternoon in late September. The year is 2006, and I have as a guest here in the studio Dr. Kenneth Deffenbacher, and a longtime member of the psychology department, my old department here at UN Omaha. Ken, welcome. We're glad to have you as our guest.
Thank you.
You're currently a professor of psychology, and you're also chairman of the psychology department, and you have been for a long time. I think my notes say since 1980. That's right. A long time.
That's a long time.
Much longer than I was department chair, I must say.
It's probably getting close to being the longest time served by a department chair. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I want to know.
And you've served in all faculty ranks since you joined the university here in 1968. And I remember that very well because I was department chairman back then and helped bring you here. But let's talk a little bit about you to begin with. Now, I know you came from the Pacific Northwest. Tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, where you went to school.
Well, I grew up, as you say, in the Pacific Northwest in southwestern Washington State. From about the time I was 3.5 or 4 years old until I went off to college. It was a rural area. My father was a forester with the U.S. Forest Service, and so I grew up on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. It was a very rural area, so I grew up in rural schools, which were, fortunately, thanks to something called timber use money, where the public schools got access to some of the money that timber companies had to pay the U.S. government to cut timber from federal land. So actually the schools were reasonably well provided for, and there were some very dedicated teachers, most of them anyway. And I remember my small town and rural education quite fondly.
How big was your high school?
There were probably between 200 and 300 kids. My graduating class in 1960 was 60, the biggest to that point. So clearly I was able to know everybody, and that was a nice touch. But when I went off to the big city, Seattle, to go to the University of Washington as an undergraduate, I discovered quickly that I was not that big a fish in a very big pond, and it was a bit of a culture shock.
Well, you went as an undergraduate to the University of Washington, and then you went on to earn a doctoral degree there.
Yes, I applied to a number of other schools and was almost going to go to the University of Oregon, but at the last moment I decided to stay at the University of Washington because I'd been admitted to a doctoral program in physiological psychology that was run both by the Department of Physiology at the University of Washington Medical School and the psychology department. But partway through my first year in graduate school, I rounded a corner in the University of Washington bookstore and happened to spy a set of books that were on sale for an undergraduate course in cognitive psychology. And one of these books, the one on top, looked very interesting. I picked it up, decided to go ahead and buy it, and at that point, I maybe didn't realize it, but I had decided to become a cognitive psychologist. So I switched areas, but nevertheless remained at the University of Washington to complete my doctoral work.
Well, how did you get interested in psychology in general to begin with?
By taking introductory psychology. I was a chemistry major, and
That's interesting. I was too when I started.
And I was doing fine. I even was sort of interested in organic chemistry. It was not particularly intellectually challenging, but I had to take some social science electives, and I happened to take introductory psychology, and after 2 weeks in the course, I was hooked. And my mother remembers it as if it was sort of like a religious conversion. I was just talking as if psychology was something pretty wonderful, and I was going to dedicate my life to it.
Well, there were some pretty outstanding people there too in the faculty in psychology, weren't there?
Yes, it wasn't a terribly large faculty given how many students they had, but even the less well-known faculty members seemed to be either really dedicated to their scholarship or to their teaching or to both. At any event, they were sufficiently dedicated that it wasn't difficult to hold my interest.
And what did your interests in psychology finally end up being? What were your areas of specialization?
They finally ended up being it was called human experimental psychology then, to emphasize the fact I was an experimental psychologist who was interested in two-legged upright creatures as opposed to laboratory rats or monkeys, though I did employ monkeys as research participants in graduate school also. But nowadays we would call it cognitive psychology. So I was interested in how minds work. In particular, I got interested in how memory, particularly visual memory, memory for pictures and faces and scenes, how that works. And so I'm a cognitive psychologist with a special interest in human memory.
That's, if I remember correctly, that's taken an applied twist too. Your interest in memory for faces and things like that.
Right. I had no, actually, I wasn't interested in memory for faces when I first came to UNO, but after I'd been here, maybe 5 years, a public defender came to me one day and asked if I would be willing to testify in a Douglas County court case. It was a bank robbery. His client was accused of having taken part, and it had to do with what we now call the psychology of testimony. It turned out that this accused bank robber had allegedly been involved in a robbery of the Ames Plaza Bank about 18 months before, and he had gotten away at the time, according to the police, and about 1.5 years later he was arrested when he applied for a federal job in Kansas City, which of course involved him having to get fingerprints, and they matched up with some he'd given earlier, apparently, and he was identified in a police lineup. And then the question was, well, the person who was the eyewitness was an off-duty policeman who had been present that afternoon at the bank, and when this gang of individuals entered, there's turned out to be quite a bit of shooting, and people were diving for cover, and lead was flying and so forth. And the question on the part of the public defender was, Well, a year and a half later, probably not having gotten a good look at this one person, since there were several, and there was quite a bit of action at the scene, and maybe the bank guard was worried about his life a little bit, could he have really had a memory for a person that he might have seen at the crime? Well, it was a good question, and I looked in the research literature, and there really wasn't anything that was directly relevant. There were some studies in the literature, sometimes based on animal studies and so forth, and some human memory studies that if I stretched it a little bit, they might apply, they might not. And so I went to Douglas County Court and testified for an hour or so. And apparently the defendant was convicted after a couple of hours of jury deliberation. The public defender said, well, my testimony probably slowed it down a little. Instead of convicting him in 20 minutes, it took 2 hours. At least I didn't pervert the cause of justice, because later the public defender told me that the defendant had confessed to him. But of course he didn't have to reveal that, and he didn't reveal it to me. It's up to the state to prove, sure, prove the case. So sometime after that, a former colleague of mine, Evan Brown, and I decided that since there wasn't much relevant literature dealing with memory for events occurring at crimes or accidents or whatever, that maybe we should set out to try to remedy that problem. And we set up a series of experiments to test some laboratory analogs of the bank robbery situation, and later ended up publishing that article in the Journal of Applied Psychology. And at that point, I became interested in the psychology of testimony, and have continued to have this applied research interest over the years. It also spurred my interest in some more basic research, because I got interested in the problem of, okay, how good is human memory for the human face, and what factors can affect this memory. And so I developed some very basic research interests on memory for the human face, as well as continued applied interest in problems with eyewitness testimony.
And you know, this is, I think, particularly interesting, because I'm sure that many people in our television audience who are watching this think of psychology as having something to do with abnormal behavior, with people in mental institutions, that sort of thing, and yet this is completely different than that. We're talking about visual perception and memory, and that's not what a lot of people think psychology's all about, that sort of thing.
Yes, it's applied psychology, but it doesn't have to do with mental health issues.
And then you mentioned Dr. Brown, Evan Brown. You and he did more than just do research on memory. You wrote at the time what became a very well-known textbook on visual perception, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, it was actually visual perception was a large part of it, but it was all of the senses. In fact, we decided to call it Perception in the Senses. We published it with Oxford University Press. It took, I think, 4.5 years from start to finish, because faculty at UNO have always had plenty of things to do besides write books. We have a lot of contact with students, and a lot of teaching to do, but it was very enjoyable. And I think by the time I finished my share of the book, which was 500 pages of typescript on a manual typewriter using whiteout, I became a much better writer by the end of that. So that was definitely a growth experience.
I've always wondered why you never published a second edition of that.
Well, we had a contract to do that once, but I did 2 or 3 sample chapters, and then Dr. Brown got sick and died not too long after that. And I just decided to try to significantly revise a lengthy textbook on my own. By then I was a department chair, and I have lots of other things to do. I just decided that it was more work than I wanted to do, and I had lots of other scholarly
And I've
interests
often
also.
thought that was too bad, though, because it was
Yeah.
such a good text.
Yeah, yeah, it was one of those kinds of texts where I think it might have sold even better, except that one way textbook publishers advertise, so to speak, is sending out unsolicited copies to people that are known to teach courses in the area. And I began to suspect that faculty members across the country, some of them, were using our text as a resource for their teaching, but not necessarily adopting it for their students. But I take that as a left-handed compliment, at least.
Well, let's get back to you here at UNO. We haven't talked about we've been talking for quite a while, and we haven't yet talked about how you came here. It was right after you earned your PhD, so I guess this was really your first full-time job.
Right, right. I had gone to the American Psychological Association meetings the previous summer and put my name in in their sort of job listing service, and apparently potential employers could buy it for $5 or whatever it was at the time.
I was the potential employer,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, and you must have bought a copy because in a couple of months I got a letter from you, which I essentially saw as a ground floor opportunity. And I think I'm guessing one of the reasons you might have contacted me is one of the questions I answered on the employment listing was geographic preferences, ? And I was bold enough to put down no strong geographic preference. So all parts of the country were open, and I wouldn't necessarily have thought of looking at Nebraska for a job, but since I indicated no strong geographic preference, you took me up on that, and I decided Nebraska was the place to go.
But it was quite a different institution than what you'd been used to in Washington.
Yes, it definitely was. It was a place where I had a former student a few years after I came here who had gone to Omaha University in his latter years, and he described it as a public liberal arts school where the emphasis was on teaching, and professors, that's about all most professors did or had time to do. And he had very fond memories of it, but it was an institution that was, I think, by and large, wanting to grow, not just in terms of student body, which it did, but to change its nature a bit from a sort of small or public liberal arts college, so to speak, to, although it wasn't just that, because it had professional colleges too, but to become more of a comprehensive university with more emphasis on research, for example, than had been true previously.
What was your first impression like when you walked onto the campus?
I had seen aerial photographs of it, so I knew it was only 52 acres, and I was obviously used to a much bigger institution. But I guess it appealed to me in some sense because I was not a product of an undergraduate liberal arts college, and sort of wished I had. I had a chance to either go to a public institution or a private one, and the private one, Reed College in Portland, Oregon, the tuition was a fantastic sum then of $1,000, and that just seemed to me to be way too expensive. So I decided to go to the state institution. But I've often thought maybe I missed something significant by not going to a liberal arts college. So there was something about UNO that made me think, though I'd never been to a liberal arts college, that maybe that was sort of what it was like.
What was your impression back then of the curriculum in psychology?
It was, I thought, a reasonably strong undergraduate curriculum, though there were a few courses that struck me as a little out of the ordinary. For example, there were courses here in areas of applied psychology, which I'd never encountered before, like industrial organizational psychology and school psychology. I'd come from a department where I think there was one professor there that had done some consulting work with Boeing in what we now call human factors psychology or human engineering psychology, and that was it. No applied well, clinical psychology was about as applied as they got. And so I learned about areas of psychology I hadn't known much about at all. And the department did have, through its master's programs in school psychology and industrial organizational psychology, I learned a lot about, it turned out to be important areas of psychology that I had known nothing about.
Well, as long as we're talking about the psychology department and your impressions of it, tell us about your long experience as a department chair. Tell us something about the department chair's job. What do you do in that role?
Well, it has changed some over the years. I became department chair in 1980, and I can remember in 1979 when the previous chair, Shelton Hendricks, who has appeared on this program before and is now Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, he asked for people that might be interested in being the department chair to indicate why they wanted to become department chair. And I'd figured out in my head that I could be department chair, which would constitute half of my time, that I would have enough time left over if I only taught one course a term, that I would get more research done than I had as a faculty member. And I may have for a while, but since 1980, universities have become more corporate. They've subscribed more to the corporate model, and there's a whole lot more in the way of accountability measures for both department chairs and faculty. So in 2006, as opposed to 1980, I spend much more of my time generating reports, justifying my existence and the department's, and answering requests for everybody, from regents to deans to whatever, requests for data of all sorts. So now I'm a much busier department chair than I used to be, just dealing with human resources paperwork. Oh, and now that we have faculty that are very active in getting grants, we have a staff member in the department that spends most of her time just dealing with purchase orders and hiring and terminating student and other kinds of employees. So it's much more of a corporate operation than it used to be.
So lots and lots more paperwork and less time for some of the things you might rather be doing.
Yeah, sometimes things I'd rather be doing. But I found that I still need to spend a lot of time keeping tabs on human relations issues. And
I was about to ask about that. I presume that those sorts of issues presented you with most of the major challenges that you had as a department chair. Can you talk about that a little bit? Or?
Yeah, for the first 18 years of my existence as a department chair, I had a irascible senior colleague who had a gift for annoying people, and in fact I can remember one time this faculty member went to visit Dr. Del Weber, a former UNO chancellor, and Chancellor Weber soon showed him the door saying, "Don't call me, I'll call you." So he had a talent for infuriating about 70% of his students in almost every class he taught. And so just dealing with him and faculty members' reactions to him was a real challenge. And then students would come to me with a petition saying, basically, we want this faculty member's head. And I pointed out that, well, okay, I would take your petition. You see, department chairs have to be both a student advocate, a faculty advocate, and judge, jury, and executioner. And to try to maintain a balance with and not make any prejudgments, I pointed out that students, it wasn't quite that simple. It's true they had made their complaint known, but then we had to let the faculty member be aware of their concerns, and the faculty member got a chance to respond. I felt I was giving a civics lesson, but anyway, enough of these complaints that turned into formal complaints over the years accumulated until about 10 years after this. the university began proceedings against the faculty member. And I think it was the first time University of Nebraska at Omaha had ever terminated a tenured faculty member. And that was a long, litigious kind of process to make sure that a faculty member is accorded every possible right. So I'm not sure that's a distinction I'd want to be remembered for, but certainly the department has run much more smoothly since that faculty member departed. In the process, I discovered that other departments sometimes have at least one person that's kind of the odd person out. And in fact, for a while, we started noting across departments. In fact, we thought we should, the secret would be to suggest to the administration that they form a special program for each of these irascible professors. And then perhaps when a budget cut, this was wishful thinking, when the next budget cut came along, they could just ditch the whole department.
Well, I can tell you that as dean, I dealt with those sorts of people in all departments, so I know exactly what you mean. But I do appreciate very much that you did not point out that I was the person that hired this individual you were talking about to begin with.
Well, I can remember I was one of the people that thought about it long and hard and voted to award him tenure, too.
Well, there's no question he was a brilliant person.
Oh, yeah, a brilliant person, but
not easy to get along with.
Not easy. And so since I became department chair, I look for little signs, when we hire people, I look for little signs and letters of recommendation and other aspects of their credentials to see, since I have this person in mind, to see if they might in some ways resemble this person in their personality or whatever. And sometimes we have actually got somebody here as far as an interview that reminds me strongly of this person. And having had the experience I've had, so far we haven't hired another person like him.
So that experience did pay off a little bit then.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's, one thing, we've talked about your research a little bit and your research interests and your education and your role as a department chair. But let's talk about your teaching, because you mentioned to me when we first walked into the studio that this wasn't, that this was a familiar place to you, because for 1 year you taught the introductory psychology course, which was taught via closed-circuit television at the time. And so you've been in here and you've been under these lights before, and you've had a little experience with it. But tell us a little bit about your teaching experience generally.
Well, it's been very enjoyable, that 1 year of doing TV 101, as it came to be known. 1,200 students twice a week, 7 or 7:30 in the morning, coming to the studio and taping lectures. That was certainly an interesting experience. I flunked my first screen test. On the monitor, I looked like I was watching the birds going south for the autumn. But I soon learned to discipline myself and not move too quickly on the set, as I was wanting to go to a visual aid. Learned a lot about the medium, but I was perfectly happy to let Dr. Thomas take over the reins.
Is that still going? Does he still do that, or have you?
No, about 1998 or 99, we decided to not use closed-circuit television anymore as a way of teaching large numbers of students, because we discovered that counselors across campus were starting to poor-mouth it. And students thought it meant that even though there were plenty of large color TV monitors in a room and there was a graduate assistant up front to answer questions and so forth, that this indicated the university didn't really care about them, because there wasn't a live talking head in front of them. What research there is suggested that students generally did about as well on exams in such a course as they would in a live course, but they didn't like it as well, cut class more and so forth. And I guess how much you learn isn't necessarily everything if the student doesn't have as fond of memories of the course as they would if there'd been a live person in front. And generally the course evaluations of Dr. Thomas and myself were a whole point lower when we were doing the television course, as opposed to being in front of 50 or 100 students in a classroom. But I thought it was an effective medium, even if students. I think it was partly generational.
Yeah. In fairness, though, we should point out to our audience that this wasn't taught entirely by watching a television lecture, that the class met once a week in small groups of 20 to 25 students, with a real live person there who would do things like answering questions, giving quizzes, all sorts of things.
And doing relevant demonstrations and so forth. So yeah, it was only 2 hours a week. There was an hour a week in a discussion section.
Live group.
So I'm not sure what it was, but a generation after I did it, the students were less enamored with, for whatever reasons, with closed circuit television.
Yes.
Although now,
well, we did a good job with it.
Yeah, no,
I mean that. Well, we did. You folks that did the lecturing did, and the TV studio here, the people that worked on it were highly professional. Did a beautiful job.
Yeah, Jim Thomas did with the TV studio, did a wonderful job. In fact, at least 1 or 2 times a week, it used to be shown over KMTV, broadcast at early morning or late evening hours to students who would watch it at home for 2 hours and then come in once a week for a discussion section in the early evening.
Was it KM or was it KYNE here?
Well, it was KYNE here for closed circuit, but I would see it appear on channel.
But broadcast was channel 12, channel 26.
Oh, okay. But it seems like I also saw it on.
Maybe.
Yeah. Maybe I don't know.
Well, years ago we did do some work with one of the, and I think it was KMT.
Yeah, that's right. The late evening and early morning was KYNE, but it was shown, at least for some period of time, I think, on a local commercial channel. But
well, we did have. I remember it quite distinctly on channel 26 because I used to have some pretty strong arguments. This was one of the bones of contention between UNO and the statewide television network, was that we'd have these shows that students were planning on watching, and then there'd be a statewide basketball tournament or something, and it would be would preempt these psychology lectures, and I used to make the argument, what are we here for? Are we here to watch basketball tournaments, or are we here to teach courses? And that didn't go over too well. I usually did not win those arguments, but at least they thought twice before they preempted our programs the next time.
Right.
But, well, those were fun challenges at the time too for a dean.
Yeah, and I think to the closed circuit on campus and then the showing of these programs off campus, a generation later there's all this fuss about distance education, and I was thinking, isn't closed circuit television but also broadcast off campus throughout the metro area, isn't that distance education?
Well, we thought of it at the time as doing that. And
I believe that course, we started teaching that on television about 1964, I think. So anyway, it wasn't internet, obviously, but we had done our bit for distance education already.
Well, again, in fairness, this is historical, so I'll mention it. The programs that originated from Lincoln, they had a top quality studio there and did a very good job with some of their educational programming. And that led to a program called SUN,
right, State
University of Nebraska. And I remember that at one time they were proposing to do an introductory psychology class, and I called up and I said, hey, wait a second, we're already doing one. We'd be glad to make our tapes available to you if you'd like to broadcast it. and they didn't think this was such a great idea because they weren't doing it themselves.
Yeah.
But there's a long history of television at UNO, and even before it was UNO. Some people here in the studio may even remember MOEBA, Metropolitan Omaha
Right.
Educational Broadcasting Association, which was a program, which is how this, how Channel 26 got started. It was a joint program with University of Omaha and the Omaha Public Schools, and it was quite successful. But that's when the television as a teaching medium was new, and it was fun.
Yeah.
But that's part of the history of the institution
Right.
as well.
Right.
Well, what psychology courses have you enjoyed most teaching?
I don't know. Is there any that I really didn't enjoy? I spent a lot of my time, especially in the first 10 or 15 years I was at UNO, teaching introductory psychology at least once a year and every summer in large 50 to 100 student classes after I stopped doing it on closed circuit television. Otherwise, probably courses in my more special area of expertise, which broadly was cognitive psychology, courses in the psychology of learning and memory, courses in sensation and perception were probably my favorite courses. Then in recent years, in the last 10 or 12 years, nobody was around after Dr. Evan Brown's death to want to teach history of psychology, so finally I worked up the course and started teaching it myself. I have found, like one of my professors said as an undergraduate, the older I got, the more interested I'd get in the history of psychology, and I found that
well,
to
we
be
lived
true.
part of the history of
Yeah,
psychology.
yeah.
Right?
And I found the longer I've been in the field, the more I say, I look at introduction psych textbooks and other undergraduate textbooks, and I see these photographs of people and say, oh, I know that person, or I've done research with them, or I've heard them give an address at a scholarly meeting or whatever. And I said, then I realized I've been around a lot longer than I thought I had been.
Yeah, when I think of it, it's a good percentage of the time psychology's been around as an academic discipline.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, one other thing I wanted to ask you, when we were talking about research, I forgot to ask you, but I notice anybody looking at your long list of publications, and the resume you gave me had, I think, 12 pages or something of research articles and so on that you published. And a lot of those were with people from other institutions. Some of them very well-known people from other institutions.
Yeah, I guess I decided in the mid-'70s that though the UNO psychology department and UNO were part of my extended ego, that if I was going to get serious about scholarship, that there just weren't enough opportunities we didn't have a doctoral program in cognitive psychology, and so I was going to have to do it myself, but maybe I could be productive by hooking up with people at other institutions. And so I've worked with people, universities on the West Coast, a person at Florida State, University of Wisconsin, people that had similar research interests, and we'd just end up collaborating on studies. So
well, how does that work? How do you get together with those folks?
Basically, meeting them at scholarly meetings, and we'd hear what kind of research each of us was doing, and then I would make, though I'm really introverted, I'd make it a point of talking to them about mutual research interests and suggest maybe it'd be fruitful to collaborate. And then as I say, I started doing that 25 years ago, and that sort of made up for the fact that we didn't have a real large faculty, especially we didn't ever have more than one other psychologist that was interested in the kind of research I was interested in. That is, no more than one other psychologist here.
Yes.
So I just decided I had to branch out, and for a while I was collaborating with people in the British Isles also. But this was a self-conscious effort. I decided I was going to have to move beyond the banks of the Missouri if I was going to get really involved in research.
Well, sometimes people, particularly people who are not working as psychologists or even as academics, will look at these and say, gee, he's going to neat places, you know, for these meetings. Are these just junkets? Are these wastes of the taxpayers' money? And the answer is, in many cases, most cases, I guess, no, they're not.
Well, the first few trips I took for 6 or 8 years were courtesy of the British or Canadian taxpayers. I'd get invited to like a week-long conference based on my previous research. And, oh, and NATO paid for one trip, week conference to Aberdeen, Scotland. So I figured as long as, and I suppose the U.S. taxpayers contribute a little to that, but as long as other countries were willing to, and I always had to shell out some of my own money, and UNO helped to do international travel. But ultimately, it led to productive research ties, and I think even to the extent that U.S. taxpayers were involved, I'd like to think they got their money's worth.
Yeah, I'm sure they did, knowing some of the things you've done. Well, professionally, you've done a number of other things besides research. You've served on editorial boards of some publications, like Journal of Applied Psychology. And,
yeah, that was as a result of my contributions to what I'll call the psychology of testimony.
Yeah.
And so I became the person on the editorial board that was responsible for reviewing manuscripts that had to do with...
Okay, I was just going to ask you that question. I was going to say, what does a person on an editorial board do? Is it just a matter of, is it honorific? You just get your name mentioned, or do you actually work at it?
The editor, when the editor gets manuscripts, he or she doesn't have expertise in all of the sub-areas within a journal's purview. So they usually identify people on the editorial board that have some special expertise, and most of the journals I've been associated with, both as a reviewer and as a contributor, send out the manuscript to one person on the editorial board and to one other non-editorial board person. And so for these manuscripts, I was the person on the editorial masthead that was the subject matter expert in deciding whether or not an article should be, well, making recommendations that then the editor could use to decide whether or not to accept or reject or suggest an article be revised.
You'd think that these people are all professional researchers and presumably doing a good job. Most of the time you'd be recommending acceptance. Is that true?
Well, I'm a pretty sanguine reviewer. I'm usually looking for reasons to accept as opposed to reject. But even PhDs don't always aren't necessarily good writers, for one thing. And sometimes you wonder if they paid much attention to their, in their graduate statistics class, or maybe they have forgotten. They sometimes make mistakes that I would hope our seniors on their final projects wouldn't make. And sometimes, I don't know, they don't get enough, have enough other people look at their manuscript before they submit it. And we all know that sometimes if we're just thinking about something ourselves and don't talk to other people about it, sometimes we can get off on a wrong track and overlook something. So a lot of manuscripts are rejected outright these days. There's a lot of decent work being done out there, but a lot of it's sometimes not, the research is just not well conceptualized.
So this so-called peer review process really serves a good purpose.
Yes, I've, both as a contributor and a reviewer, it's absolutely essential, whether it's for articles or for deciding whether the scientific merit of grant proposals. I've served on some, for the U.S. government, some grant review committees, and I think it's absolutely essential there. It's
This
better
for like the National Science Foundation?
Yeah, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Justice, and the National Institutes of Health. And I've also reviewed some for the major Canadian government funding agency. But otherwise, if you don't have peers who knows what's going on, then it's going to be probably done on the basis of politics and so forth, as opposed to scientific merit.
One thing I do want to mention, and I do so at the risk of embarrassing you, Ken, I'd like to point out some of the honors that you've received here. For example, just a few years ago, you won the UNO Award for Distinguished Research and Creative Activity, and that's certainly a strong honor here.
Yeah,
and for a while you also had a professorship here, the Regents Professor.
Yes, in the 1980s.
And you've, besides that, been willing to share your time with the university, making it a better place by serving on a number of committees and things of that sort.
I served 2-3 hitches on the UNO Faculty Senate. Never had any aspiration to be a Faculty Senate president. I was on the steering committee of the American Association of University Professors chapter for a number of years and was president for a year or two. I served at least 2 hitches on the advisory committee to the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, which for years had to make all the personnel recommendations to the Dean, reappointment, promotion, and tenure. Had to...
And that's not a small amount of work.
Oh.
Since I was the person for many years to whom those recommendations were made, I know the amount of effort.
Dozens and dozens of portfolios to go through, and for a while we were responsible in the 1970s for making merit salary recommendations at the college level. And back when we had...
Always a thankless task because nobody's happy with it.
No. And then when we used to have, when the Vice Chancellor's office still had a so-called equipment budget, we had to get together and rank order department requests for various pieces of equipment. It was a very busy committee. Since then, they've separated out some of these functions into various other standing committees, and it's not quite so much work. But I enjoyed that because it was an opportunity to help kind of shape the policies and determine the people that would be continue to be around the college.
I always like to point out, for the benefit of people who are not in the academic community, that these sorts of tasks by professors are very, very important. And as a matter of fact, I like to point it out to people who are in the academic community, because I've heard people say, well, I just don't have time for that stuff. And if you don't have good people making time for that stuff, you don't get good decisions made.
Right. Well, most faculty would agree that faculty should be involved, at least to some extent, in university governance. But if faculty aren't willing to take on these kinds of tasks, then they're not going to be involved in faculty governance. So,
I just wanted to say that from my perspective, those sorts of efforts are truly appreciated, because there's no way we can thank you enough or properly recompense you for the amount of effort that goes into it.
Well, the one thing I've noticed in the last 25 years or so, that whether it's the Faculty Senate or the AAUP or some faculty committee, that over that period of time, I think a fairly strong sense of community and camaraderie developed between the faculty and the UNO administration, such that each was watching the back of the other. And I didn't sense that there was a whole lot of us against them kind of strife, that really it was a fairly close-knit community. And maybe it's because a significant number of faculty were willing to step up and be involved in faculty governance and to do a pretty good job of it.
I think that's true, and as I say, I'm very much appreciative of the kinds of effort that went into it. Let's talk for a minute about, you've been here for lots of years now, 38 years. Tell me a little bit about what you've seen going on as changes in the university? What sorts of things were different back when you first came here than they are now?
Well, when I first came here, it was a place where practically all faculty had, with maybe the exception of our department, where you as department chair had instituted for people that had a research program and some research productivity, a quarter-time research assignment, as long as they continued to justify it. It was a place where there wasn't, people were teaching 4 courses a semester, and there wasn't much time to do scholarship. On the other hand, and faculty were involved in faculty governance, but it just seemed like a small state college where everybody was just involved in teaching, and there was a lot of service and not much time for anything else. But it has become much more of a comprehensive institution, a comprehensive university, much more in the way of graduate programs and research, but still a lot of maybe even closer relations with the community than when I first came here. There's much more in the way of town-gown relations that I think many more faculty are involved in providing their expertise to the community. And so it's become much more a sort of bigger time institution, I think, than it was.
That's an interesting observation, because I came here when it was still Omaha University, and at that time I had never seen an institute. Well, I hadn't seen that many institutions, academic institutions, but I'd never seen one where I thought there was such close work between. In fact, we ran things for the city of Omaha. We have now. You mentioned earlier school psychology as being one of the major programs. Well, now we have big organizations in the state that are service, what do they call them? They serve school districts.
Oh, educational service units.
Educational service units, yes, that hire many school psychologists and others to help schools with problems both in school psychology and in other areas too. And back then in the city of Omaha, there was the Child Study Service operated by Omaha University, and they did all of the work in child psychology for Omaha Public Schools. And that was a joint venture between the university and the school system. We had in industrial psychology, we had what's now become CAPS, which is the Center for Applied Psychological Services, I guess, isn't it? Before then, it was the Center for, can't remember, Industrial and Institutional Research or something like that. And did the same thing under a different name, but it was very closely related to many of the Omaha business, many in the Omaha business community. So that is a tradition that's gone on for a while, yeah. And it may very well be that it's even bigger now than it was then. But yeah. I hadn't never thought of it that way.
Yeah, I think instead of being quite so closely kind of joined at the hip in terms of UNO and the City of Omaha directly collaborating to run operations for the city, they started doing it themselves. But now it may be that because faculty aren't teaching quite so many students, they manage to find a little bit more time to they and their students to volunteer their expertise, yeah. As opposed to being directly involved in the operation. Maybe that's the difference.
Well, in the few minutes that we have left here, let's talk a little bit about people. You must have memories of many people at the university. Some of them we've talked about already, faculty people, but there are students, there are administrators, chancellors, vice chancellors.
Yeah, I guess there have been, except for 1-year interim chancellors, I guess I've had 4 since I've been here. Well, he was called a president then, Kirk Naylor, and then Ronald Roskins, who of course then became University of Nebraska president, Del Weber for 20 years, and then Nancy Belk, and I have definite impressions of all of them. I remember the first time I really talked to Kirk Naylor, there was a tradition when I first came to UNO, I don't know how long it had been there, that was, I thought, rather quaint. In my first January, I was called down to see the president, and I went in, he served cake and coffee, I think.
It was a big birthday party, right?
Yeah. Each faculty member got to visit with the chancellor or the president on his birthday, and I thought, well, that was something I didn't expect when I signed on here, although it didn't continue after my first year.
Well, it was small enough then,
yeah.
So as soon as it started to get larger, that was
right.
hard to do. But it was very nice to establish that kind of personal relationship with the,
right.
with the head man at the institution.
And when President Roskins came, he certainly was dynamic. And the one thing I noticed, he seemed to improve town-gown relationships in the sense of getting himself on boards of directors of important businesses, and I saw it pay off. He got a number of important buildings built on campus. Once I remember the governor kept vetoing appropriation. I think it was for the UNO library, but an important building.
Was Hyper Building was
or maybe it was the HPER
yeah.
building. And finally, it was rumored that he got together the president of Northwestern Bell Telephone, Northern Natural Gas, and one other major mover and shaker, and went down to see Governor Exon. Well, we got the appropriation shortly after that. So I thought, now that's, I had never really thought much about that as a faculty member, but if you have a chancellor or a president who can get things done that way, that whatever else I thought about him, that was an important thing to get done for the university.
We've generally been fortunate in having pretty solid administration who've stayed around here long enough to be able to accomplish things like that. Well, Ken, I really appreciate your being here this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Glad to do it.
And for our audience, thank you for joining us today in a visit with Dr. Kenneth Deffenbacher, professor and chair of the Department of Psychology at UN Omaha. We've been taking a look at some of the history of UN Omaha as seen through the eyes of the history makers. This is Jack Newton, inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.